was last year. I was watching an episode of Knuckles, the TV show spin-off from Sonic the Hedgehog, voiced by Idris Elba. And yes, despite my film reviews being pretentiously highbrow, or at least desperately wanting to be so, I am not above watching shows like Knuckles. We grew up playing the games. But what struck me about that episode was, and I don't want to sort of lean into any conspiracy or something, but as you may have read from the title of this episode on The Last Picture Show, subtle Zionism, the kind of messaging that at least is being pushed. I'm not even saying that this is post-October 7th. This has just been something that has always been there. But this episode really brought it home for me. So you have Knuckles and his sidekick partner in crime, Wade Whipple, I guess if I'm remembering correctly. And they happen to be over at Wade's mother's house. Now, I did not know this. I didn't think it was relevant at all to the show. But apparently Wade is Jewish, and they happen to be over on the Sabbath. And the episode is then spent with a lot of family infighting, being a somewhat dysfunctional family, but then all of them coming together to, of course, celebrate this Jewish tradition of the Sabbath, and of course his mother going on to explain the sort of cultural, historical, religious relevance of the high holiday, if I'm getting that right. And what struck me, and this is perhaps something that I've been noticing over the years, that in representation of the three predominant faiths, I wasn't going to say great faiths, not of course to offend anyone, but in terms of great, I mean sort of in terms of numbers. When it comes to Christianity or Islam, Hollywood isn't as forgiving or isn't as tolerant. I don't want anyone watching this episode to feel as if I'm trying to play up a conspiracy. But at least over the past, I would say, maybe let's say 2 decades. Whenever, for example, Christianity is presented on screen, it's often, let's be frank, it's often been negative. The reverence you would perhaps see in depictions in earlier cinema, say for example 30, 40 years ago, I think that has been lost. I mean, sort of that sort of respect, the reverence, the deference that was being given to America, and specifically, I'm talking about Hollywood in this case, that was given to that faith. That's gone. One could get into what's it called, the socio-political undercurrents as to why that happened, but we're not talking about that today. But characters who are shown to maybe profess the Christian faith on screen, I mean, the way they're written, either it's treated with derision, okay, this person's weird. I guess perhaps the same way in which I guess MAGAs and Republicans and are treated. Or then, of course, it's presented as a flawed, faith, in which its adherents are being hypocritical. I remember that the comedian Pete Holmes, he had that, I think, short-lived, I think it was just 1 season long, TV show, and he was a character in that who was sort of like, trying to sort of navigate the Big Apple, being a Christian comic. There was that. But I can't remember, other than sort of like Christian faith movies, like that Jim Caviezel one. I'm forgetting that one that came out and was last year, I think, and it was a big hit about sort of the trafficked children. But I can't remember any film of late that has at least positively like depicted somebody who is, who professes, faith in Christ and sort of is a practicing Christian. I can't remember something like that. Of course, then it comes to Islam. For the past 20 years, and before, I would say sort of even as far back, I would say, as the 80s, it was, though not readily associated in the 80s and 90s with, terrorism. But I mean, sort of, whenever you would have like, Chuck Norris beating on terrorists or Arnold Schwarzenegger or any of the sort, I mean, it was hard. I mean, sort of like, audiences could put two and two together that if this guy has a name like Muhammad, is speaking Arabic, then yeah, chances are he is most definitely Muslim. Although at least at the time, they would somehow or the other kind of maybe downplay that somewhat, or at least it would be sort of, these guys are just like, loons. They're terrorists, they're crazy, forget these guys. Of course, then 9/11 happened, and sort of we have been through the ringer ever since. Either it was, it was your typical Islamo-fascists, bearded, wild, brutal, sort of like, men deserving of their deaths, or then it was sort of moderate Muslims who weren't really Muslims. They were sort of more culturally Muslim, and they were, of course, believers in democracy and sort of like, doing things the American way, and they were opposed to it, and those were always the victims. And at least for the longest time, that was how the narrative was presented. It was a very clear-cut sort of dichotomy, almost black and white, that sort of if you profess the faith, if you were a believer, you were of course a fundamentalist terrorist. If you were not, you were then one of the good ones, right? Sort of like, the only, as they used to say about Native Americans, only good Indian is a dead Indian. Sort of the only good Muslim in this case was one who didn't believe in Islam and wanted to somehow reform it and make it more Western. And I mean, we've been sort of like, force-fed that for going on almost like 25 years now. In between, I think when sort of like, people stopped buying that message, there were attempts to sort of rehabilitate the Muslim image, there were attempts to bring in more Muslim, South Asian, Middle Eastern creators, filmmakers, to somehow or the other present a more nuanced character or characters. I know I'm skipping quite a bit, but of course we're talking about something else today. But one of the most recent examples was Miss Marvel, about, of course, a Pakistani-American superhero. And that at least did try, I'm not going to say it tried and failed or tried and succeeded. That's for maybe another show. But it definitely did try. It attempted to present just regular people who are sort of like, Muslims. They do, they don't drink, they don't eat pork, they don't like screw around or anything like that. They're just like regular people. We had something quite different with Rami Youssef's Rami, which was also... That was an interesting one. I think I could do a whole episode on that, but maybe for some other day. But generally, I would say the portrayals have been negative. I mean, sort of, I would say 90% of the times, it's just some guy saying yalla yalla, and he has a Kalashnikov in his hand, and all he wants to do is like, kill a bunch of white people, and of course, he hates them for our freedoms. He hates all white people, all Westerners for their freedoms. What those are, I don't know. But of course, when it comes to the portrayal, or at least the portrayal of Judaism, Jewishness, and then of course Israel, because this episode is about sort of subtle Zionism. There are sort of blatant ones as well that I'll be talking about, but in just that on-screen portrayal, I think it's been somewhat favourable. I mean, for me, he is a comedy god. He is a personal hero, and at least in my heart of hearts, I think that he's not a Zionist, unlike that Jerry Seinfeld. I was going to say something else, but I'm going to keep it parliamentary here. That is, of course, Larry David. Now, Curb Your Enthusiasm, which has run for 12 seasons, almost 24 years. That, and of course, they have that wonderful episode on Israel-Palestine, which everyone should watch. In that, his Jewishness is ever present, because himself, most of his friends are Jewish. They're sort of they are the affluent, they are the ones who sort of for whom LA is their playground. But I've never felt in that show that it was an attempt to somehow pitch or advocate or anything else. It was just sort of, this is, sort of a part of my culture. This is who I am. I guess it's also my faith. I mean, I can't speak for Larry David, but I guess that's what he's trying to say. And I never, it just adds to the richness of the character and the story and everything that's being told. There's no sort of this insidiousness, if you will, in trying to in try to propagandize something. So that was, I would say a real decent attempt. And why I'm even talking about that is that sort of I've often seen that in these shows, being sort of at least culturally Jewish, or at least sort of having that presence there, it's at times, sometimes I feel it is an attempt to propagandize the faith. It is an attempt to insert where there is no need. And at least that's what I felt with Knuckles, in an episode like that. I wonder if, for example, this wasn't an episode about, for example, Wade Whipple's character wasn't Jewish, and maybe, for example, he was Christian. But of course, somebody, anyone celebrating Christmas or Easter, it's now become more cultural than it has been religious. But say, for example, we were to take, imagine if the character were, I don't know, Waris Muhammad instead of Wade Whipple, or Waris Wahid. Imagine that character, sort of having Knuckles brought into his home, and they are maybe celebrating Eid. I think there would be, I don't think it would be do great in the ratings, number one. And I think sort of some concerned Christian group in America would be like, oh my God, this is they're trying to introduce Sharia law. But sort of in talking about the Sabbath, I don't think, I don't think people would have instantly felt something's going on here. Maybe I'm reading into this too much. Maybe something isn't going on here, but I just feel that there's this undercurrent. And there's been a bunch of movies and shows over the years that I've felt that are either sort of blatantly sort of pro-Israel, pro-Zionism. And in other instances, they're just sort of that Larry, the Curb Your Enthusiasm level of sort of enthusiasm for Judaism. But we are, the films and shows that I'm going to talk about right now are not going to be Holocaust-based ones, because that's something completely different. I'm not going to be talking about that. But over the years, these are some of the examples that I've that come to mind. And one that came out even last year was another TV show, which was the disappointing Masters of the Air by Apple TV, a continuation of the Band of Brothers, sort of like, that whole trilogy. There's this one episode, I would say, towards the end. I would say, I think this is the last episode or something where, they are now... it's in fact the one of the pilots, a Jewish character, a Jewish man who is now in what's it called, sort of the Russian advance into Germany, and they're liberating camps and so what. And I think there's this one instance in which I think they've liberated a camp, and he's talking to some people, and one of the people who've just been liberated from these concentration camps says, and I've lost everything, blah blah blah, and then the character asks him, oh, so what are you going to do? He says, what else is there left for me to do? I must go to, I don't know if he says Palestine at the time or he says Israel. I think he says Palestine, but he's like, that's all I have left for me. I think that even including that moment in the thing somehow kind of smells of Zionism. Like there's this thing like, oh, now having suffered, unfortunately, through the Holocaust, and sort of like, are now sort of like, for us now, our sort of, not even reward, but what is just, what needs to be done right by us is to give us a homeland. Of course, the pilot does not respond. There's no response there. As an audience, as a viewer, I would have said that at the expense of the Palestinians. But I guess the writers decided to put that in. There's another movie that comes to mind. I don't know why, but I remember, I think perhaps because the character was played by George Peppard, Hannibal from 18. This is 1966 Tobruk, which is, of course, about World War II. And he plays a Jewish character who is there with the British soldiers and commandos. And there's this one particular thing. I think he's a German character who, sort of he's a German Jew who is now fighting against, of course, the Germans, the Nazis, and he's now with them. And there's that one thing where, he sort of like defiantly tells, I think, one of the other characters that, oh, we don't need your support, we don't need your help, all we need is is the land of Israel, and that is our right, and that is what we will claim. Now, of course, this is the 60s and 70s. 65, you had, of course, 67, you had the 6-Day War, I think the 66 film, but like sort of, you had that sort of, most of the Western world, sort of the past 75 years, has had that sort of warm and fuzzy feeling towards Israel. That sort of, they are deserving of this homeland for the suffering they endured during the Holocaust. Again, at the hands of Europeans, which nobody wishes to bring up. It's apparently sort of the Palestinians' fault, and so they must now suffer. But I remember that particular thing. I'm going to try and go through this chronologically. Well, no, not really. Okay, fine. I've been chary of watching Israeli movies because, of course, it's hard, I guess, for them as a society. Sort of, it's as Churchill said, a fanatic is one who can't change the subject and won't talk about anything else. To paraphrase him, of course. And at least a lot of the stuff that does come out there tends to be sort of suffused with that sort of Zionist message. But there have been a couple over the years that I have seen. One, of course, is Waltz with Bashir, a animated movie, 2007. Which also happened to be the time that Israel and Hezbollah traded blows. Now, this movie is, of course, about the Lebanese civil war, in which Israel played a very large part. We will never, of course, forget the atrocities that they committed in the Shabra and Shatila Palestinian refugee camps. And this particular movie deals with the trauma that the filmmaker in this case, himself a soldier at the time, has now to deal with all these years later. Such self-examination is rare from Israelis. Of course, there are fine people among them who realize that this entire settler colonial project is fundamentally flawed, even evil. And this movie does attempt to examine that, does attempt to examine Israel's role in the Lebanese civil war, in their sort of mania, this monomania that they have for self-preservation. They must ensure that all others are sort of ground into the dust. So I think that's a movie that is rare to come out from such a country, but it does examine, it does reflect. So yeah, I think I will speak favorably of that. There are some other movies, one at least I think is coming this year. I think it's The Teacher or something like that. I'm forgetting it. But that also, it focuses on a Palestinian boy in the West Bank. And let's, of course, not forget documentaries like No Other Land, which was made with Israeli filmmakers. But that's a documentary, not here. But then there was another one that I saw, Wolves. And I saw this because even though I didn't know at the time that Tarantino was so pro-Israel and such a Zionist, he did recommend the movie. And this was Wolves, a 2011 movie. It's a crime film, and thankfully it has no, what's it called? It's not a movie, it doesn't have anything to do with Palestine or Israel and Palestine. But there is a very telling moment in the movie. Whether in song, whether in stories or in movies, you know, sort of the Native American is often sort of at times treated like a ghost, something that has now passed into myth and legend. And, you know, sort of when a glimpse is caught, it's like, for example, the Tasmanian wolf, the thylacine, that you catch it in the distance and it's gone. A very fleeting moment. And that's what we see in this movie, where at one point, one of the characters, I think, stumbles out of his home, and sort of there, astride a horse, is a Palestinian. And no words are exchanged, but it's just like a look. And that was like, you know, sort of a cowboy stumbling upon a Native American, the native population exterminated. And only sort of like, you know, their legend remains. So that was good. I like that. Of course, I completely skipped a movie like the TV show Fauda. I wasn't going to sit through that. No way in hell was I going to do that. And that's why I didn't even bother with another attempt by Netflix to sort of lionize the state of Israel with the Red Sea diving resort starring Chris Evans and Michael K. Williams. This is, of course, about a covert mission by Mossad to not repatriate, but at least rescue, Ethiopian Jews. Was it Somali Jews? And, of course, bring them back to Israel just so that they can get neutered. Nothing to laugh about, but that's exactly what happened to these people. I wasn't going to watch a movie about this. No way. I'm not going to watch a movie that seeks to portray Israel and its security forces as anything other than occupiers, because they're not liberators. No. They have subjugated at this point in the movie, I think it was in the 80s when this actually happened. They had been subjugating the Palestinians, oppressing them for a good 50 years. So no way am I going to watch a movie that even remotely speaks about them favorably. Even though you do have that moment in Charlie Wilson's War where Tom Hanks's character, Charlie Wilson, is sitting across from a Mossad agent chief played by Scottish actor Ken Stott, and he's sort of begging him to, you know, provide materiel for the Mujahideen's war against the Russians. That was interesting. We can't, of course, forget 2005's Munich by Spielberg, And of course, that stairwell scene where you have Eric Bana's character talking to the one of the members of, I think, Black September. And, it's a conversation about sort of like, what are you fighting for? I mean, sort of like, and sort of the Palestinian is defiant in that whether it's sort of like, sticks, whether it's a thatch house, whether it is sand or dust, we will continue to fight for it. Just as the Israelis feel that they must fight for this patch of land, the Palestinians, of course, are going to fight. What was Spielberg's comment on on sort of this entire thing? I think in his way, because the thing is that he has touched upon, World War II, of course, and of course the Holocaust with Schindler's List. He has he has touched upon these themes many times before. I'm wondering what kind of a sense we got from where he stood on this particular sort of issue. Yes, I mean, sort of it is presented. I mean, let's not even get into the actual events of what happened in the Munich, the Olympic Games. But I think you still get a sense that this movie is, despite showing the sort of inner turmoil and the demons which with Eric Bana eventually then sort of immigrates to the US, he carries for carrying out this sort of assassination sort of campaign against those in the Black September. It is presented as sort of almost a righteous campaign, that these terrorists were deserving of what they did to these Israeli athletes. Maybe, I guess, we can talk about that one in great detail at some other point. But I'm now going to move on to, one that really sticks out. I remember even at the time, I was like, I like this movie. I like everything they've done. But this one, it rankles. And that is, of course, World War Z. Brad Pitt, globe-trotting as he does, eventually ends up in Jerusalem. Because the Israelis, being the, sort of bleeding edge sort of military state that they are, apparently they were up on the zombie virus before everybody else. And of course, in sort of almost in glowing terms, they talk about sort of, the 13th man, and sort of like, because of everything that's been done to us, and like, our neighbors and the neighborhood and everyone wants sort of is baying for our blood. We've always been on our toes. And because of this, we were quick. We knew something was off. And that's why, we were like, okay, we're already a military state. We've already walled off, this entire country. So we at least are not going to succumb to this zombie virus. And I mean, like, at least, to anyone in the audiences, or at least, to an Israeli audience, they would have been like, yeah, that's damn right, man. That's exactly who we are. We are, we're just like, sort of these one of a kind, sort of like, it's like having a forward operating base, sort of a FOB, as they say, sort of in amongst enemies of all kinds. So there you have this lone, beleaguered, outnumbered, outgunned, sort of like, sort of outpost of democracy and Western values in the Middle East. And they're surrounded by these savages, and they're holding out. So if anything were to make the case for Israel, for Zionism, this is it. And of course, a very telling moment from the movie itself is that when sort of at the border crossing, because Israelis are magnanimous like that, right? They are so welcoming. They allow the Palestinians who are out, like, sort of beyond the wire, They're left out there. They welcome them into sort of the walled city. And it's there that sort of the peacenik Israelis and the Palestinians greet each other with song and dance. And it is that very song, that ruckus that they kick up, that sort of starts to attract the zombies. So, I mean, very on the nose for anyone who's paying attention, that sort of allowing these people in our midst opens us up to a world of hurt. Because, of course, what it follows is the city falls. You know, all of that sort of revelry and, like, you know, the Nova Music Festival type stuff, welcoming your neighbors, allowing these human animals into our society leads to their eventual destruction. And that's what happens. World War Z was an interesting one. I'm going to end this one with a film that came out last year, and one of my favorites from last year. And that was, of course, Bradley Courbet's The Brutalist. Adrian Brody's character is the Hungarian Jew who immigrates to America with wife and niece in tow. And over the years, like, this is sort of an epic in that way. The niece grows up. And there's a scene in which Adrian Brody is with his wife, Daisy Ridley. Is it Daisy Ridley? No, it's the other lady. And sort of they're sitting across from the now grown-up niece and her husband. And she is preaching, of course, the value, not the values, but the merits of Zionism, telling her uncle that sort of it is the duty of every Jew to now go back to the homeland promised to them 2,000 years ago. And, you know, sort of, we must now rebuild and sort of bring it, you know, we must do our part. And Adrian Brody Laszlo, that's his name in the movie, he's kind of nonplussed. He's like, why not do it here? Why not make a life for yourself here? But no, she's the Zionist, whereas he is perhaps the more secular Jew, the more sort of realist, and one perhaps who hasn't bought into the propaganda, who hasn't sipped on the Kool-Aid. Now that, of course, in the wake of October 7th, there have been a slew of sort of Zionist documentaries about this, October 7th itself, sort of globalized the Intifada, all of that stuff. And you even had an Israeli show that was put out recently, I think it's called Red Alert, about the attacks on that day. But then, thankfully, countering that narrative have been movies about Palestinian history, about everything that has happened over the past 2 years, this genocide in Gaza. And both documentaries, No Other Land, I think it was called Dispatches from Gaza, if I'm not mistaken. That was that one, if I'm forgetting the name. Of course, The Voice of Hind Rajab, which I'm eagerly waiting to see. Then there's the Encampments documentary about sort of the student protests in the United States, Palestine 36, and hopefully a lot more. Because while sort of the Zionists have been very active in putting out their message and have been doing so for the past almost 80 years now it's time for there to be far more both Palestinian voices as well as voices supporting the Palestinian cause and putting their message on screen.